You ever get that feeling that someone's watching you? Like, even when you're alone, there's something just off? I used to think it was just paranoia until last year. What happened to me still keeps me up at night. And if I had made just one wrong move, I might not be here to tell this disturbing story. Welcome to Disturbia. It started like any regular night. I was at home, just scrolling through my phone. It was around 11:30 p.m., and I was getting ready for bed. Nothing out of the ordinary, just another quiet evening. I live alone in a small apartment. Nothing fancy, just a basic one-bedroom place in a decent neighborhood. My routine was simple: shower, brush my teeth, check my phone one last time, then sleep. That night was no different. At least, that's what I thought. I was already in bed, lights off, when I heard a sound. A soft click. My apartment isn't big, and that sound? It came from the front door. At first, I thought I imagined it. Maybe it was a neighbor, or the wind shifting something outside. But then, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate click, like someone was testing the lock. I froze. I live alone. No one else has a key, and I sure as hell didn't invite anyone over at midnight. Every hair on my body stood up. My heart started racing. I didn't want to move, didn't want to breathe too loud, but I needed to check. Slowly, I slid out of bed, trying to make as little noise as possible. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed to the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought whoever was outside might hear it. I looked through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I let out a quiet breath, almost laughing at myself. Maybe it really was just my imagination. Then, my phone vibrated in my hand. A notification. My blood ran cold when I saw what it was. It was from my security app, the one connected to my smart lock. I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just read. Then, before I could react, the door handle turned. I panicked. My fight or flight kicked in, and I did the first thing that came to mind. I ran back to my room and locked the door. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. But before I could press call, the door creaked open. I don't know why I didn't run. Maybe I thought if I stayed quiet, they'd think no one was home. Maybe I was just too scared to move. Either way, I did the only thing I could think of. I slid under my bed, pressing myself against the floor, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear them now. Slow, careful footsteps moving through my apartment. They weren't in a hurry. They weren't panicking. They were taking their time. They knew someone was here. I held my breath as the footsteps got closer. I could see their shadow through the gap beneath my bedroom door. They just stood there, not moving. Then, the doorknob rattled. I bit down on my hand to keep from making a sound. A long silence. Then, a click. The door started to open. I don't know what happened in that moment, but survival mode kicked in. As soon as I saw the door move, I bolted. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and swung it as hard as I could at the figure standing in the doorway. The person let out a grunt and staggered back. I didn't wait to see who it was. I ran. I sprinted out of my apartment, down the hall, and straight to my neighbor's door. banging like my life depended on it. Because it did. The cops arrived minutes later. They found my front door wide open, but the intruder was gone. The only clue left behind? My smart lock had been hacked. Someone had disabled it remotely, letting themselves in without a trace. They never caught the person. No fingerprints. No security footage. It was like they were never there. But I know they were. And they know where I live. I don't live in that apartment anymore. I moved. Got rid of my smart lock. Got cameras. But to this day, I still wonder, what if I hadn't woken up? What if I hadn't checked my phone? What if I had just slept through it? Would I even be here to tell this story? There's a moment right before something terrible happens. A stillness. A pause in time where everything feels normal until it doesn't. I've thought about that moment a lot. Wondered if there was something I could have done differently. If I had made a different choice, would they still be alive? I don't know. But I do know one thing. This story, it could happen to you. It was supposed to be a simple trip. Just me, my best friend Mark, and his girlfriend Olivia. A weekend getaway to a cabin in the woods. Cliché, I know. But we weren't looking for anything thrilling. Just a break from city life. Mark was the one who planned everything. Had found this secluded Airbnb, right by a lake, surrounded by nothing but trees for miles. Perfect for disconnecting, he said. The drive was long, winding through endless back roads, cell service cutting in and out. As we got closer, the sun dipped below the trees, turning the sky into this eerie shade of red. I remember Olivia joking about how it looked like something out of a horror movie. If only we had known how right she was. The cabin itself was unsettling, not run down, but old. The kind of place where the wood creaks no matter how careful you step. The owner had left us a note, welcoming us and reminding us to keep the doors locked at night. That should have been our first warning. That first night, we sat around a small bonfire out back, drinking, laughing, just enjoying the silence of being away from everything. But then, Olivia stopped talking, just went pale, staring past me into the woods. I turned. A figure stood at the tree line, motionless, just far enough that we couldn't make out any details. No flashlight, no phone glow, just standing there. "Hey," Mark called out. No response, just silence. The kind that makes your skin crawl. Then, without a sound, the figure turned and walked away. We locked the doors that night, shut the windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, I stepped outside to get some air, and that's when I saw it. Footprints, not just at the tree line, all around the cabin, circling it. Some came right up to the windows, right up to the door. I woke Mark and Olivia, my voice shaking as I showed them. Maybe it was the owner checking in on us? Olivia offered weakly. Mark shook his head. Not in the middle of the night. We should have left then. But we didn't. We thought we were just being paranoid. That we'd laugh about it later. We were so wrong. That night, the storm rolled in. Heavy rain, wind howling through the trees. And sometime after midnight, I woke up, not to thunder, not to wind, to footsteps inside the cabin. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. Mark and Olivia were asleep in the next room. I reached for my phone. No service. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving through the living room, closer to my door. I swallowed my fear and crept out of bed, pressing my ear to the wood. Silence. I turned the knob as quietly as I could, pushing the door open just a crack. And there, in the dim glow of the hallway, stood a man. Not Mark, not a stranger who looked lost or confused. A man in dirty clothes, his face obscured by wet, matted hair, and he was holding a knife. I don't remember making the decision to run. I just did. Bolted past him, shoving the door open with everything I had. I heard Olivia scream as I slammed into their door, yelling for them to wake up. Mark was up in an instant, but before he could react, we heard it. A second set of footsteps. More than one. We weren't alone. The next few moments were a blur of chaos. We ran. Out the back door. Into the storm. Our bare feet sinking into the mud. The rain was so heavy we could barely see. But we just kept running. Because we could hear them behind us. Chasing us. We made it to the car. Mark fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. The engine roared to life just as we saw them. 3 figures standing at the edge of the woods, watching. But one of them was closer, right behind Olivia. She didn't even get to scream. 1 second she was there, reaching for the door. The next, she was yanked backward into the darkness. Mark lunged after her, but I grabbed him, screaming, pulling him into the car. He fought me, yelling her name, but I threw the car into reverse and slammed my foot on the gas. And as we sped away, tires skidding on the wet road, I made the mistake of looking into the rearview mirror. I wish I hadn't, because Olivia was there, standing on the road, motionless, and behind her, barely visible in the rain, was a hand on her shoulder. We never saw her again. The police searched the area for weeks, found our abandoned cabin, found the footprints, but they never found Olivia. Just a scrap of her shirt, torn and muddy, deep in the woods. And the worst part? 3 weeks later, Mark got a text from Olivia's number. It was just a photo, blurry, dark, but we could still make out her face. And she was smiling. I still think about that night, about what we could have done differently, about whether she's still out there, somewhere. And if she is, she's not Olivia anymore. Check your doors tonight. In the early months of 1922, the Gruber family lived on a secluded farm known as Hinterkaifeck, deep in the forests of Bavaria, Germany. The family consisted of Andreas Gruber, a 63-year-old farmer, his wife, Kazelia, age 72, their daughter Victoria, 35, who had lived with her parents for years, and her 2 children, 7-year-old Joseph and 2-year-old Maria. Life on the farm was solitary. Surrounded by thick woods, the Grubers were cut off from the nearest village, which was several miles away. Despite the isolation, the family's life was not without its challenges. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was a man known for being difficult and stubborn, with a reputation for being somewhat of a recluse. His daughter, Victoria, had a strained relationship with her father. There were rumors that Andreas had been abusive toward Victoria, and it was suggested by some that he may have been the father of her child, Joseph. However, these rumors were never definitively confirmed, and the truth remains murky. The family had always been somewhat withdrawn, but they had been relatively self-sufficient, relying on their farm to meet most of their needs. Yet, by the beginning of 1922, there were signs of something more ominous looming on the horizon. In the months before the murders, strange occurrences began to unsettle the Gruber family. The most notable of these was a series of odd noises in the attic. Andreas Gruber, a practical man, first noticed them in late 1921. He would hear footsteps above him in the attic, and at times, he would even hear voices. He believed that someone was hiding in the attic, but when he went to investigate, he found no one there. The noises persisted for weeks, and Andreas grew increasingly paranoid. He checked the attic for hidden rooms or passageways, but nothing was found. He also noticed strange footprints leading away from the house and into the woods, but he could not explain them. He became convinced that someone was living on the property in secret. In addition to the strange noises, there were signs of someone entering the house when the family wasn't there. Doors and windows were found open, and personal items were moved around. The family had a maid who had been employed for some time, but she abruptly left the farm in March 1922, citing fear and the strange happenings on the property. Victoria's sister, who lived nearby, offered to come stay with the family, but they declined. They had become increasingly fearful and isolated. On the night of March 31st, 1922, tragedy struck at Hinterkaifeck. It is believed that the murderer, or murderers, entered the farmhouse through a trapdoor in the barn. This trapdoor led directly into the attic, which was an easy point of entry. The person or people responsible for the murders likely waited until the family was asleep, then began their violent attack. The first to be killed was Andreas Gruber. He was bludgeoned with a heavy object, possibly a pickaxe or a similar tool, while he slept in his bed. The force of the blow would have been enough to kill him instantly. His body was found later in the barn, along with the bodies of the other victims. Next, the murderer made their way to the room where Kazelia, the elderly mother, slept. She too was killed in the same manner, bludgeoned while in bed. It seems that the killer did not stop there, however, as Victoria and her 2 children were also murdered. Victoria was found dead in her bed, her skull crushed by a similar blow. The young children, Joseph and Maria, were not spared either. They were both found in their beds, each struck with brutal force, their small bodies crumpled and lifeless. After killing the family, the murderer seemed to take a strange, almost deliberate pause. The bodies were left where they had fallen, but the murderer did not immediately leave the scene. Instead, they stayed on the farm for several days, possibly even using the family's resources for sustenance. During this time, the family's livestock was tended to, and the farmhouse was occasionally entered, though the murderer did not seem to take anything of value. This raised further questions about the motive. Was this just a random act of violence, or was there something more personal driving the killings? The bodies of the Gruber family were discovered on April 4, 1922, by a neighbor who had noticed that the family had not been seen for several days. The authorities were immediately called, and an investigation began. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders was launched almost immediately after the bodies were discovered. Detectives quickly realized that the crime scene was unusual. The bodies had been left undisturbed for several days, and it appeared that the killer had stayed on the farm, undetected by neighbors. The police initially believed that the murderer had been hiding in the attic, and they began searching the area for clues. They found a number of strange items, including a bloody pickaxe, which they believed had been used in the murders. The pickaxe was found in the barn, and it was covered in blood, suggesting it had been used to bludgeon the victims. The authorities also interviewed the family's neighbors and friends, trying to uncover any possible motive or connection to the murders. However, there were no obvious suspects. The Grubers had lived an isolated life, and there were few people who could offer insight into their daily routines or relationships. One suspect, the Grubers' former maid, was questioned by the police. She had left the family's employ just days before the murders and was known to be fearful of the house. However, she had an alibi, and there was no evidence linking her to the crime. As the investigation continued, the police began to focus on a more specific line of inquiry: the possibility of an insider being involved. Andreas Gruber had been known to be a difficult man, and his family had a number of enemies. There were rumors of a strained relationship between Andreas and his son-in-law, Victoria's former husband. However, Victoria's ex-husband had an alibi and was cleared of any involvement. Despite extensive investigation, the identity of the murderer remained a mystery. The police were unable to find any solid leads, and there were no witnesses to the crime. The killer's actions seemed almost methodical, as if they had planned the murders carefully and knew the layout of the farm well. The idea that the killer had been familiar with the farm raised suspicions about people who had lived or worked there. A number of suspects were questioned, but none were ever definitively linked to the crime. Over the years, various theories have emerged about who might have been responsible for the Hinterkaifeck murders. Some believe that it was an outsider, someone who had been lurking around the property for some time. Others suggest that the murderer was a member of the Gruber family itself, or perhaps someone with a personal vendetta against them. Despite numerous theories and ongoing interest in the case, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved to this day. The tragedy has continued to haunt the village and the surrounding area, with many people still wondering who could have committed such a horrific crime. The darkness hides more than just secrets. It hides the truth you might not want to know.